Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pittsburgh Sports Memories podcast. I am your co-host, Tim Hannon, and with me as always.
Steve Wirt, that's me.
So, Steve, this week the Steelers play the Bengals, and I thought it'd be a good time to look back on the history of this rivalry. I think when you think of Steeler rivalries, you think of the Ravens and the Browns, and going back a few years, the Oakland Raiders, or even the Dallas Cowboys. And you don't always put the Bengals at the top of the rivalry list, but they're a team that has always been there for the Steelers. In fact, the Bengals are the only team since the AFL NFL merger that have been in a division with the Steelers the entire time. So that means that the Steelers and Bengals have played each other more times since the merger than either of those teams has played any other team. Pittsburgh leads the series 67-36. So what's that? Basically the Steelers have won 2 out of every 3. So the Steelers have definitely owned the series, but it doesn't mean there haven't been some, close games and definitely some stretches where the rivalry was more evenly matched. And the way that I thought I'd go through this is to break it up into the 5 decades that these teams have been playing each other. So we'll kind of go one decade at a time. So before we do that, Steve, your general thoughts on the Bengals rivalry.
The Bengals franchise or the rivalry with the Steelers? I
Both.
mean, both. Well, the Bengals as a franchise haven't had much success, unfortunately, for Cincinnati and people in Kentucky. And maybe that's because they've been in a division with the 6-time Super Bowl champion Pittsburgh Steelers. Maybe it's because they haven't been run the best over the years. But I think we'll get more into their history to begin with. But it's just the Bengals are just like one of those teams. Every once in a while, they'll jump up and beat the Steelers. But like you said, like 9 times out of 10, it seems like when it matters, They're just one of those teams the Steelers seem to beat. I don't ever really remember a big Bengals like where it's like, oh, a heartbreaking Bengals loss. And there's definitely been at least a couple of those with the Browns where the Steelers needed to win the game and the Browns were kind of in their way. At least, no less this last year in the playoffs. But even before that, the Eric Metcalf game and stuff like that. But
Yeah, there's a few times we'll go through it. There's definitely a few times where the Bengals have gotten the better of the Steelers, but yeah, by and large, it's been a more one-sided rivalry. But again, still, I think a lot of good history and some memorable moments. So let's start. Like I said, we're going to do this by decade. Let's start in the 1970s, and let's actually start with the year 1970 because that's the year that the AFL and NFL merged. And the Steelers and Bengals, who have never played each other before this, are both placed in the AFC Central Division, where they'll play each other now twice a year. The Bengals were a relatively new team at that point. They had been founded in the 1960s by Paul Brown. He's the same guy who founded the Cleveland Browns.
it's kind of like his hate team for the Browns after he got fired by Art Modell. He just like started like, well, I'm gonna show you, Art Modell. I'm gonna start my own franchise in Cincinnati.
And it was weird too. The Bengals have like the exact same uniforms as the Browns for a lot of years. They eventually changed and they go to those striped helmets and everything. But they had these plain orange helmets and orange and white uniforms. And they wasn't completely plain like the Browns. It just said the word Bengals on them. But when those, if you look at like footage from the 1970s of those two teams playing each other, it looks like an inter squad game.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's just kind of funny how like there's like a whole NFL franchise was just started just because he hated the Browns and Art Modell. It's like,
Yes, as NFL franchise founded out of spite.
yeah,
So in 1970, not only are those two teams put in the newly formed AFC, they're also both moving into new stadiums. Three River Stadium in Pittsburgh and Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati And what's funny about those two stadiums is they're almost completely identical. There was two other stadiums, Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia and Busch Stadium in St. Louis, that were also very similar. And this was during a time when cookie cutter multi-purpose stadiums were very popular that could host football and baseball. And this design whatever this design was. I mean, it's very similar, Steve. If you live in a housing plan, there's probably three other houses in the housing plan that look exactly like yours, the exact same floor plan and aesthetics. And that was kind of the design for stadiums back then. So Three Rivers and Riverfront, I mean, when you saw them on TV, it was hard to tell, who was playing at home.
Well, it's gotten that way with baseball now too. I've noticed, like, ever since PNC Park came out, it's like I don't know if they use the same architecture firm or something, but like they literally have to put name. Like, used to be like when you played at PNC Park, you could tell, oh, you have that little wall behind them. That's the distinctive look of PNC Park. And even Dodger Stadium, you can, but boy, now they have to put the names of the ballparks behind the thing, or you wouldn't know, one stadium for another. And I don't know that football stadiums really have like baseball stadiums, because every football stadium's kind of the same. So I don't know if there's the same kind of aesthetic going on, but
Yeah, that's
they
true.
do have the Escalooser. I know that's not yet. That's in the new stadium.
Yeah. We can talk about that when we talk about their current stadium.
Yeah, the Escalooser.
So you think of the 70s obviously as a decade that the Steelers owned, but in the early 70s, the Steelers are actually still building, and the Bengals had a pretty good team. Cincinnati wins the division twice in the early 70s. So they're actually the first team that's good in that division, but it's pretty short lived. The Steelers, of course, become one of the greatest teams of all time, and the rest of the decade belongs to them. Now, that doesn't mean that the Bengals totally sucked. They have a quarterback during this era named Ken Anderson, who is a borderline Hall of Famer. A lot of people argue that he should be in the Hall of Fame. He leads the league in passing yards twice. He's even named the league MVP at one point. He just kind of has the unfortunate position of being in the same division as the 1970s Steelers defense. And really, one season that really can just summarize everything. 1976, the Bengals only lose 4 games all season, but 2 of them are to the Steelers, and as a result, they missed the playoffs.
So they went 12-2 and missed the playoff, or no?
10-4, because there was only 14 games back then.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah. Oh,
but
wow.
but still, I mean, could you imagine? The Steelers last year in 2020, they lost 4 games, and they were the number 3 seed in the playoffs. Can you imagine losing 4 games and not even being in the playoffs? And really, they only had one wild card back then, and so it was really important to win your division. And because they lost both the games to the Steelers, they didn't win the division.
Wow, that's crazy. That will make me hate the Steelers, that's for sure.
Yes, for sure. 1976, also the season that Paul Brown decides to retire as head coach. But since he still owns the team, he obviously gets to name a successor. And he makes the rather dubious decision to promote his offensive line coach, a guy named Tiger Johnson, instead of his offensive coordinator, who was a guy named Bill Walsh. And that decision will come back to haunt them, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, whatever happened to that Walsh guy?
Yeah, we'll find out.
Tiger Johnson, I bet, was pretty awesome now, since I've never heard of him before like 30 seconds ago.
It'd be pretty cool to have a football coach of the Bengals named Tiger, but aside from that,
that's obviously why Paul Brown picked him. I mean,
there had to be some marketing play that he,
Bill Tiger. Well, we're the Bengals, and we got to go with Tiger. Sorry, Bill Walsh. Have a nice career, winning 4 Super Bowls or whatever. 3. I guess he won 3. But
yeah, only 3. He's no Tiger. He's no Tiger Johnson.
Yeah, who won 0.
So
I'm going out on a limb and saying he won 0. I don't even say it.
Yes, I'm pretty sure I don't have to look that up to tell you that you're right.
Yeah.
So there's 3 games that I want to just kind of cover from the 70s that are notable. The 2 teams played each other in the final game of the 1974 season. And the Steelers by that point had already clinched the division, and the Bengals had already been eliminated. So there was really nothing for either team to play for. The Bengals also had some injuries, including one to Anderson. So they had a backup quarterback in. And Paul Brown decides to essentially just kill the clock for 60 minutes. The Bengals run the ball literally almost every play and don't do much else. Paul Brown actually only calls 3 different plays on offense the entire game. So it's basically like a game of Tecmo Bowl, only like minus one of the plays.
And
Literally,
you don't
that's
have Bo Jackson, so yeah.
right. I mean, literally, that's what he did. He only called 3 plays, and he just kept calling them over and over again. And the one that he calls the most often is just a run up the middle, and he calls that almost every down. So basically, it's just like run, 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 punt. They just want to like end the game and get out of there, I guess. And you would think the Steelers would maybe be okay with this because it's the last game of the season. They're about to head into the playoffs. They get to kind of just coast into the playoffs, easy win. But they're actually really ticked off about it. After the game, Jack Ham, Joe Green, a couple of other guys all kind of sound off in the press about how they really wanted a competitive game to get them ready for their playoff game the next week against Buffalo, and how they thought it was disrespectful of Cincinnati not to give them that. And this was a different time, because now, the Steelers in recent years, including last season, they've had a number of, the last game of the season means nothing, so they rest all the starters. But back then, you didn't do that, whether it was preseason or the final game of the regular season. You just didn't do that, and so the Steelers actually are kind of insulted by this. They of course go in to win the Super Bowl that year anyway, so I guess they were still ready for the Bills. But I just thought that was an interesting story about that game, that Paul Brown just basically gave up, and the Steelers were mad about it.
It's kind of a weird. That's a weird thing to do, but at the same time, like what's the difference between that and like you said, what teams do now, where they don't start anybody, they just start a bunch of scrubs, and I don't know what to say. Like you like, don't you owe it to your fans to do something? I mean, where was this game at? Was this in Pittsburgh or?
Yeah, I think it was in Pittsburgh.
So, like, basically, you ripped off all the Pittsburgh season ticket holders, which I guess if you're Paul Brown, you don't really care about. I mean, I don't know. Like, I would feel like if it was a home game, I feel like I owe my fans at least something. They bought a ticket and came to the game.
It's an odd decision for an old school coach like that too, because again, that wasn't normal at the time. Like, you just play, like you're getting paid to play, you play, and it was just an odd decision. So
yeah, and it's true. You do feel like they're the fans are the customers, and you owe the customers something for their money. I mean, you can't completely rip somebody off. But I guess with those customers, I mean, I guess you could debate too nowadays. Like, would those customers be more happy if you win a meaningless game or the Super Bowl? Well, of course they're going to be more happy if you win the Super Bowl. So, well, didn't Billick do that? Remember one year he didn't rest anybody, and they ended up losing the next week.
Yeah, that
was
was the 2003 final game of the season, and thank God he didn't, because that's what allowed us to draft Ben Roethlisberger the next year. If we win that game, then I think Buffalo drafts in front of us, and they wanted a quarterback, and we don't get Ben. So,
well,
good on you, Ravens.
Well, we would have got J.P. Losman, so I mean, would have been all right.
Yeah, exactly. Another game of note, in 1977, the penultimate game of that season for both teams was Steelers at Bengals. And the Bengals came into that game one game behind the Steelers in the division. And Anderson throws for over 300 yards against the Steel Curtain defense and leads Cincinnati to an upset. And that actually puts the Bengals in first place and in control of their own destiny. All they have to do is beat Houston the next week, and they win the division, and the Steelers are out of the playoffs altogether. And again, this is in the middle of the 70s dynasty. They were about to knock the Steelers out of the playoffs and win the division, but it doesn't happen. The Oilers beat the Bengals 21-16 in the last game of the season. That sends the Steelers into the playoffs instead of Cincinnati. And the Steelers are so appreciative that they actually take up a collection and buy every Oilers player and coach leather briefcases, which, Steve, is kind of an odd gift for football players. I don't know why they thought leather briefcases would be a nice thank you gift, but I mean, it's the thought that counts, I guess.
I'm trying to who is their quarterback? I forget who the Oilers
Dan
quarterback. Yeah,
Pastorini.
maybe he really needed he's kept losing all his plays, so he had to put him in. Yeah, Bum Phillips was like, "Hey, you better get a briefcase to hold on them plays." And it's like, "Hey, the Steelers brought me one. Awesome." Him and Earl Campbell were like, "This is awesome."
Yeah, I mean,
Could you see Earl Campbell with a leather briefcase ever in his life? I mean, Earl Campbell
no,
is a lot of things, a Hall of Fame running back #1, but leather briefcase just doesn't seem to fit his style. Let's see,
yeah.
big belt buckle, cowboy hat, cowboy boots, leather briefcase. Or that something doesn't work here.
Yep. So that was kind of a blown opportunity for the Bengals. And then 1979, the two teams, the game they play at Riverfront, going into that game, the Bengals are 0-6 and the Steelers are 5-1 and on their way to their fourth Super Bowl title. But the Bengals not only upset the Steelers, they blow them out 34-10 when they're 0-6 and the Steelers are on their fourth Super Bowl season. So that's kind of an interesting result there. Can you imagine, Steve, what Twitter was probably like after that loss?
Yeah, I heard Chuck Noll said that Jack Ham and all them, they weren't allowed to be on Twitter that week. They're doing too much TikToking or something. Lynn Swan was just TikToking away on the Bengals logo before the game, and that caused a big stink.
I mean, losing to an 0-6 team, I just can't imagine the fan base just, fire Chuck Noll, and that's what it'll be today.
Well, this is 1979, so Stan Savran might have had his radio show, Sports Beat 1979. Stan, what's wrong with Chuck Noll and the Steelers? I'll hang up and listen.
So that was definitely a big upset, but of course, by and large, the 70s belong to the Steelers. So moving into the 80s, things definitely flip around a little bit in the 80s. December 13th, 1981 is a big game for the Bengals. Bengals 17, Steelers 10 at Three Rivers Stadium. It's really the Bengals' first meaningful win in the series, and it gives the Bengals the AFC Central Division title that year. Anderson completes 21 of 35 for 215 and 2, and he later says, quote, "That Steelers game was one of the most satisfying of my career. It really felt amazing given the ramifications that came from that game, and it was the springboard for us going to our first Super Bowl." So, Ken Anderson, who played for the Bengals for many, many years, that was a big, big win for him. And it did propel them to the Super Bowl that year, where they lost to Bill Walsh.
And the 49ers. And Ken Anderson was kind of the king of the dink and dunk pass before it was, I mean, they didn't really keep track of air yards back then, but I have heard that about Ken Anderson.
And well, that was the West Coast. I mean, that was Bill Walsh, the West Coast offense, right? So, I mean, that would have been typical.
And I guess we'll go over that later in the podcast, but Ken Anderson actually plays a big hand in a Super Bowl win for the Steelers later. So
yes, he does. 1982 is an interesting game because it's the only season in the last 50 years where these teams only met once. And that was due to the fact that there was a player strike that year. And it ends up being one of the more memorable Steelers Bengals games. We covered this briefly in our episode we did about the 82 playoffs. The Steelers block a field goal. The Bengals were going to kick the game-winning field goal. The Steelers block a field goal to send the game into overtime. And then in overtime, Dwayne Woodruff picks off Kenny Anderson. And so the Steelers get the ball in overtime, and then this happens.
2020 is the score in overtime. Game's over. Touchdown Steelers, John Stallworth. Bradshaw to Stallworth. Touchdown Steelers, and Pittsburgh wins again.
So that was a big win for the Steelers because the Bengals were the defending AFC champions at the time.
I'm not the smartest football person ever, but you might want to cover a Hall of Famer. I mean, there was nobody within 20 yards of John Stallworth, and they caught that in the corner of the end zone. So, I mean, you might want to cover a Hall of Famer there.
Yeah, it was the Steelers had the ball inside the 5, and I think the Bengals were completely 100% sold on the fact that Chuck Noll is going to run the ball here because that's what Chuck Noll always does. And I think they just totally caught them off guard with a pass. The funny thing is that, so in 103 meetings that these two teams have had, only 4 of those games have gone into overtime, and 3 of them are decided on touchdown passes.
I know one of them. Well, now I know 2 of them, I guess. That one. There's another touchdown pass one that decided another one.
Yes, so the Steelers won 3 of them, and the 3 that the Steelers won out of those 4 were all decided on touchdown passes, which you just don't see that much in overtime, right? Usually in overtime games decided by a field goal, sometimes a running touchdown or a turnover, but all 3 of those Steeler Bengals games that went into overtime were won on Steeler touchdown passes. So just a little fun fact there.
What was that San Francisco game where Garrison Hurst ran for like 100 yards? I guess it was.
Yeah, that was against the Jets in '98. It was a 98-yard run, I think.
Yeah.
In overtime, yeah. So the Steelers got the best of the Bengals that day, but really the rest of the decade belongs to Cincinnati. They transitioned from Ken Anderson, and Forrest Gregg was their coach at the time. They transitioned from those 2 guys to Boomer Esiason and Sam Wyche. The Steelers, meanwhile, as we detailed in our 80 Steelers episode, flounder for the entire decade. Between 1985 and 1990, the Bengals beat the Steelers 9 out of 12 times. So, not a lot of memorable games there, but there is one that sticks out for me. It's on October 26, 1986. The Steelers beat the Bengals 30-9 at Three Rivers Stadium. And that's surprising because the Steelers are 1-6 going into that game, while the Bengals are 5-2, and really one of the powerhouses in the AFC. But the Steelers not only win, they win by 21 points. And the reason it sticks out for me is because it was the first Steeler game I ever went to. My dad had season tickets in the 70s. And then when my brother and I were born, he gave them to a relative. And then I was about 9 years old at that point, and he decided to start going back to the games and taking my brother and I. And that was the first game that he took me to. And I've been going to games with my dad ever since. So that's a memorable one for me, October 26, 1986. And it was a game that, we just expected the Steelers to lose by a lot, and they win by a lot. So
that's pretty cool. Yeah, that's neat. See, and you actually remember a lot of anything memorable, anything still stick out all these 30 years later, however long that is?
I can't say I remember much about the actual game. I remember going, I remember being there, and I remember, the Steelers winning being a shock. I can't say I remember, who scored touchdowns or anything like that, unfortunately.
Mark Malone threw a pass to,
Weegee Thompson or whoever, I don't.
Louis Lips.
Right, right, yep. So by and large, this decade was mostly a reverse of the 70s, where the Bengals were the contender and the Steelers were mostly not the contender. The Bengals do make it to another Super Bowl in 1988, where they lose to Bill Walsh.
That decision isn't haunting them at all. That's 2
No.
Super Bowls they've single-handedly lost because they picked Tiger Johnson.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep, and they lost that one, of course, in heartbreaking fashion. The Joe Montana leads the last second drive, and so the Bengals 2 Super Bowl appearances, but both times the 49ers beat them. There is some animosity between these 2 teams in the 80s. It's nothing quite like what's about to come some years later, but there is some animosity. There's an incident where Keith Gary, who's one of the Steelers' many first-round busts that decade, he literally rips the face mask off of the helmet of Ken Anderson, which nearly paralyzes Ken Anderson. Like, he twists his neck around and he actually can't feel his legs for a while, apparently. It's a pretty violent play. A lot of people in Cincinnati were upset about that one, and, deservedly so. And then, Steelers running back coach Dick Hoke, who was with the Steelers for, 107 years, something like that. He's the one that actually gives Sam Wyche the nickname Wicky Wacky Wyche, after Wyche screws up a game-tying field goal attempt against the Steelers in 1987. So what had happened was the Steelers were up by 3. There's only a few seconds left, but the Bengals had the ball on the Steelers' 18-yard line. And instead of spiking the ball and then running out your field goal unit to stop the clock, I guess Wyche just ran out the field goal unit and time expired before they could ever get a kickoff. So the game actually ends with them having the ball on the 18-yard line. They never even attempted the field goal. And after the game, Dick Hoke says, quote, "Wicky Wacky Weiss screws up again." So that nickname kind of stuck. And Sam Weiss, as we've detailed in some of our other episodes, was a little unorthodox as a head coach for sure. He didn't have a ton of run-ins with Chuck Noll or the Steelers because, again, in that era, the Steelers just weren't much competition. Not the same as what he had with teams like the Oilers and Browns. So that's the 80s.
I never thought like Sam Weiss was that bad of a coach. I don't know. I remember him having that name, but I always thought that's because he like called like crazy play calls. Like he would just like, I don't know, 3rd and 15, let's run the ball or something, something weird like that.
Yeah, and he would do stuff that was kind of like not breaking the rules, but kind of Belichickian, where he'd figure out ways to manipulate the rules. Like they had to make that rule about you aren't allowed to, like, once your offensive guys are in the huddle, they have to stay in the huddle, because he would wait for them to, he'd have like 3 running backs in the huddle, and he'd wait for the defense to put in like all their, goal line set, and then he'd like run out the running backs and put in like 3 receivers, just to like stuff like that. And stuff where they never had to have a role before that, but then they did. Like I said, kind of Belichickian before Belichick. So, and of course
they do that in college though. Like, I don't know, like now they changed the rule too, like, because they used to because I remember Pitt would always get mystified by this. Like, and I remember North Carolina doing it a lot, and some other teams did it. Like, if there's like you're coming out of like a TV timeout, like, sometimes those are long, like they'll just huddle right on the sideline. And if you huddle on the sideline, you can have all 50 players standing there. So you don't really know who's coming out on offense. And they would just run right out to the line of scrimmage. So you would be stuck with whatever defense was out there. And so I don't know, like I noticed, like you said, like I know they had to make that rule, but also there's ways around it. Like you'll see times where like the quarterback will stand off like 5 or 10 yards away while they're changing players, so like you can still substitute guys, in and out, as long as you aren't in the huddle technically, I guess. But I guess we don't thank Sam Weiss for all that silliness.
He would have been proud.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the 1990s. And in the 90s, things flip again, and boy, do they flip big this time. Paul Brown dies in 1991, and his son Mike takes over as owner and general manager, and he flat out sucks at both jobs. Those are 2 jobs he holds to this day, by the way. Some fun stats for the Bengals under Mike Brown's leadership for the last 30 years. They're the only team with 3 9-game or more losing streaks. During his time as owner, there's been 25 NFL teams that have started a season 0-6, and the Bengals have 6 of those teams. They also have 4 of the 13 0-8 starts during that time. So 1/3 of the 0-8 starts during that time have been Bengal teams. They've gone winless in October 9 different times. And probably most significantly, they have 0 postseason victories. Mike Brown is the equivalent of Bob Nutting Jr. He's an owner that just does the absolute minimum to invest in his team, doesn't understand how to run a team, doesn't understand when to bring in new coaches and when to fire people, when to draft the appropriate talent. I mean, he's not good at being an owner or a general manager. He definitely should not have both jobs, that's for sure.
Like when's the last playoff game Cincinnati won? I remember, I think we said that in one of the other podcasts. I can't remember.
It was 1990. They beat the Houston
Raiders?
Oilers.
Oh no, they beat the Oilers. Okay.
Yeah, and the next week they lost to the Raiders in the game that Bo Jackson got hurt.
That's what I'm thinking. Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So they have not won a playoff game since 1990.
Right, since Bo Jackson was in the league. So that's how long ago that was.
You realize there are people that are like 30 years old that have never seen a Bengals playoff win?
Yes, that's correct. that's correct. I mean, that's
you answered that like you're on the witness stand. Yes, Your Honor. Yes. It's like, holy cow.
The math checks out.
That is as bad as the Pirates. Wow,
Yep.
that's ugly.
Cincinnati is the worst NFL team of the 1990s. They lose 108 games during that decade. And I think, Steve, I couldn't fact check this, but I believe this is around the time that Myron Cope starts calling them the Bungles.
Yeah, the Bungles. Yeah, that's right.
And we talked on our last
Yeah.
episode about how Myron Cope came up with all this stuff that would just stick for years. That's one that always stuck, him calling them the Bungles. I mean, to this day, that people still call them that.
And non-Steeler fan, like it
Right.
doesn't even have like ESPN announcers are called the Bungles.
Right,
Yeah.
right. The Steelers, meanwhile, are reborn under new head coach Bill Cowher, and they're one of the more successful teams of the decade. So during the 1990s, the Steelers mostly owned the series, but again, that doesn't mean it's not competitive. Some memorable games from that era. In 1992, the Bengals drafted this quarterback out of Houston named David Klingler. He was the number 6 overall pick, super highly touted coming out of college. I think he had a game in college where he threw for literally like 700 yards. And so, I mean, this was going to be the next great quarterback. His first ever start that season is against the Steelers, and they sacked David Klingler 10 times. And that's more or less the end of David Klingler. Like, he never amounted to much in the NFL, much like every other Cincinnati pick that decade. And they had so many high draft picks.
I think that's the scariest part of his well, they made Achilles Smith, like that was one of the, and Kajana Carter. I mean, I can't blame him because that guy was really good.
He went to Penn State. I can blame him.
But he was really good in college. He was
for Penn State.
Achilles Smith wasn't that good in college.
Don't draft Penn State running backs. That's
unless they're named Franco.
Well, yeah, and Larry Johnson had a pretty good career, but other than that, don't draft Penn State running backs.
The guy for the Giants might be all right.
Yeah, if he doesn't get hurt every year. But we digress. 1995, there's a Thursday night game at Three River Stadium. We talked about this in our 95 Steelers episode. Steve and I were at this game. It's a very miserable memory for both of us. Jeff Blake, the Bengals had moved on to a quarterback named Jeff Blake at this point. And Jeff Blake was never a star quarterback. But two things, he always he threw a really pretty deep ball, and he always seemed to kill the Steelers. And that game, boy, did he kill us. I mean, he just was throwing these rainbows to Darnay Scott and Carl Pickens, who were their two receivers. And the Steelers at that time, Rod Woodson had gotten hurt. They had a very patchwork secondary, and Jeff Blake just destroyed them. Later that year, there's a rematch at Riverfront. And that's another really memorable game because once again, the Bengals jumped out to a huge lead, but this time the Steelers actually come all the way back and score a bunch of points in the second half. And probably the most memorable play from that game happens late in the second half. And I'm going to play the clip of it. It's an interesting clip because the announcers for NBC are Dick Enberg, Paul McGuire, and Phil Simms. And Paul McGuire and Phil Simms literally predict this play before it happens and then openly root for Cordell Stewart. It's a long pass to Cordell Stewart from Neil O'Donnell, and they actively root for him to score during this play.
Dick, I promise you, Phil and I have already agreed. I promise you that they're going to throw the ball down the middle one time to Cordell Stewart because this guy looks like a racehorse. There's nobody even near him.
You know what it is? He's getting in the slot at those three receiver sets. The defense is playing zone, so nobody can account for him running right down the middle of the field.
There he is, slot left. There he goes. He's there.
This was in Riverfront, right?
Yes.
Wow, there were a lot of Steeler fans there.
Yeah, that's
there was a loud roar when that happened.
Yeah,
that wasn't just Phil Simms and Paul McGuire. That was the crowd was cheering too.
Yeah,
I do remember them. I remember watching that game on TV, and I remember them calling that too. I remember them saying, "Oh, he's going to score. He's running down the middle, wide open."
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of just epitomized the Bengals of that era when they're sitting up there able to predict the play because the Bengals defense was so bad. Uh, so yeah, that was a memorable game and a memorable play that kind of helped launch Cordell Stewart into that slash role that everybody kind of remembers him fondly as. A couple years later, there's a game again at Riverfront in 1998, and this time Neil O'Donnell, who threw that pass to Cordell Stewart, he's on the Bengals and starting for the Bengals. He leads a 93-yard last-minute touchdown drive to beat the Steelers. And Carl Pickens, we mentioned him before, the receiver. Talk about a guy that just destroyed the Steelers. He burns Dwayne Washington twice on that final drive, once for 50 yards on a fourth down play, 50-yard gain, and then again on a game-winning touchdown throw from Neil, which came on of all things, a fake spike play. Pickens finishes that game with over 200 yards receiving. He was very good against the Steelers, and Dwayne Washington was not very good for the Steelers.
Yeah, I remember why. I think we watched this game over your house, and I just remember being so annoyed because it was Neil O'Donnell. Neil O'Donnell, oh my gosh, of all the quarterbacks in the world, why you? Why do you wander into against us? And Dwayne Washington just couldn't cover a jump pass. It wasn't like Carl Pickens was just running by him. It was just these jump balls, and Dwayne Washington was the worst at covering a jump ball. Carl Pickens just basically out jumped him. It was bad.
Yeah, that was kind of Dwayne's career.
Yeah.
He, like you said, that's why he lasted so long, because he didn't get burned. If you watched him, he would be on a guy, but he just had no spatial awareness. He could be there, he could be on a guy, but then the guy would still catch it for whatever reason. And that was just the story of Dwayne's life, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So that's the 90s. Again, the Bengals were just beyond miserable in that decade, and the Steelers were pretty good. So moving into the 2000s, some new stuff for the new millennium. First off, new stadiums for both teams. So Paul Brown Stadium opens in 2000, complete with the Escalooser, as Steve referred to earlier. They have this huge escalator that carries people kind of in and out of the upper stands. And ESPN, because the Bengals were still bad in that era, used to just always run anytime they would run the NFL primetime highlights, they would just always kind of end it with people filing out down the escalator midway through the fourth quarter. So nice stadium, but famous for the big escalator. And then the year after that, Heinz Field opens in Pittsburgh in 2001. The first home game at Heinz Field in Heinz Field history is actually against the Bengals. So new stadiums, but at least at first it seems to be more of the same. Steelers good, Bengals bad. In 2001, there's an interesting game late in the season at Cincinnati where the Bengals win in overtime. We talked about the 4 overtime games, and Steelers won 3. This is the one that the Bengals won. It's only the 3rd loss for the Steelers that season, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really impact their record. The Steelers were very good that year, and they were still the number 1 seed in the AFC playoffs, even with that loss. But what's interesting about that game is the reason the Steelers were dominating the league that year is because they had built this really stout defense, and no one else could solve it. But the one guy who figures out how to beat it is Cincinnati's head coach, a guy named Dick LeBeau, who you might recognize as having coached the Steelers defense in 4 different Super Bowls. He has the offense run out of a spread formation, and John Kitna, who's the Bengals quarterback, attempts 68 passes and completes a lot of those for 411 yards. And the Bengals win. It's an unorthodox strategy to pass 68 times and run out of a spread formation, but it beats the Steelers, and that actually carries over into the next season. The first 2 games of the 2002 season, as we talked about in our Tommy Maddox episode, were against the Patriots and the Raiders, and they copied that strategy and they destroyed the Steelers defense, and then everybody else was kind of onto it by then. And the 2002 defense became all of a sudden very easy to pass against. And that was kind of the end of that mini era for the Steelers.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know who their offensive coordinator was. It might have been Bruce Coslet or somebody like that. Who ended up being? I think he ended up being a head coach for them for a couple of years. But Yeah, somebody figured it out, and then nobody figured it out till later that year. Charlie Weiss and Bill Belichick figured it out, but
Right. Right.
so
Things really start to change in 2003. Both teams are moved to the new AFC North division by that point, and the Bengals hire a new head coach named Marvin Lewis. Marvin Lewis is from Pittsburgh, from Fort Cherry, I think, and was an assistant coach for the Steelers in the 90s. So, he's a guy that has a lot of Pittsburgh history. He's hired as head coach of the Bengals. The Bengals also that year drafted a quarterback from USC named Carson Palmer. Coincidentally, in the same draft, the Steelers select Palmer's roommate, a guy named Troy Polamalu. The next year, the Steelers draft a quarterback of their own, a kid named Ben Roethlisberger from Miami of Ohio. And by 2005, both teams are really good. They both have these young stud quarterbacks. And for the first time in, really decades, there's actually a lot at stake when these two teams meet. So the team that the Bengals are building is pretty talented, but is incredibly unlikable. I mean, they stocked their team with a bunch of guys who were either like criminals or just flat out jerks. They actually had 9 different players arrested in the same season. 9 out of a 53-man roster were spent time in jail. Chris Henry was one of those guys. When Henry was at WVU, Rich Rodriguez, the head coach at West Virginia, stated, quote, that Henry was, quote, an embarrassment to himself and to the program. I mean, Steve, can you imagine how hard you'd have to work to be called an embarrassment to the WVU football program? Like this is
none other than Rich Rodriguez.
Yeah,
too, right?
I mean, this is a program
that's
that
like Todd
itself.
Graham questioning your loyalty. That guy's really not loyal. It's like, wow. That's crazy. Wow. That I never had heard that quote before, but that's a good one.
Yeah.
I guess they just kind of fell into that trap. And the Bengals aren't the only team to fall into this. I think the Steelers have fallen prey to this at times. They just see the talent and think, well, we can reform this guy, or once he gets here, we'll be strict and we can get him to change his ways. And sometimes that works out, but I think for my experience, most times it just is more heartache than it's worth.
For sure, every team has fallen into that trap. The Bengals during that era seem to stack guys that had that in their track record. Aside from the guys getting arrested, Chad Johnson was one of the more outspoken players on that team, aka Ocho Cinco. He was very cocky, very, look at me kind of player who a lot of Steelers fans, a lot of people around the NFL disliked. TJ Houshmandzadeh was their other receiver. He famously wiped his feet with a terrible towel. He was another guy that was very cocky. My favorite TJ Houshmandzadeh story that he told years later was that he was trash talking Troy Polamalu. He said something to him and swore at him and was trash talking him. And Troy turned around and said, "God bless you, TJ." And TJ Houshmandzadeh years later said, "I felt so bad and I never said anything negative to him again."
That's one way to stop the trash talk, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kill him with kindness. That's
Yeah.
Troy for you. So even TJ Houshmandzadeh, who was, a class 1 kind of jerk, he even felt bad about trash talking Troy. So 2005, the Steelers win the game at Cincinnati, but as we detailed in our 2005 trilogy episodes, the Bengals win a late season game at Heinz Field and they win the AFC North. The Steelers have to win their final 4 games of the season just to squeeze into the playoffs as the number 6 seed. And that sets up a wild card playoff matchup at Paul Brown Stadium. And, I think we all remember what happens in that game. On the first drive of the game, Carson Palmer drops back to pass. Kimo von Oelhoffen rolls into his leg. And that's the end of Carson Palmer for a long time. Just totally shredded his knee and he's knocked out of the game and has to go through months and months of rehab. And so the narrative for that game, of course, is all about how Kimo, who was a former Bengal, by the way, injured Palmer on purpose, and the cheating Steelers won the game thanks to that. They really didn't deserve it. So that's kind of the narrative. Rarely mentioned is the fact that the backup quarterback in Cincinnati was John Kitna, who had been their starter before Palmer got there, and who was a pretty good, solid veteran. And also rarely mentioned is the fact that Kitna leads the Bengals to 17 first half points. I mean, if you score 17 points in a playoff game in the first half, you should be in pretty good shape, right? But not those Bengals. They reportedly get into a locker room fight at halftime. Allegedly, Chad Johnson and Hugh Jackson, another winner, Hugh Jackson, are in the middle of that one. And keep in mind that this is at halftime when the Bengals are in the lead. So just, their immaturity and their inability to handle any kind of adversity whatsoever just caused them to collapse. They surrender 17 unanswered points to the Steelers in the second half, and they're eliminated. And, I don't want to underscore this too much. I mean, losing Palmer was big. It certainly was, and that's a hard way to, to especially on the third play of the game, right? But you know what? A couple of years ago, the Eagles drafted a quarterback named Carson Wentz to replace a guy named Nick Foles. And they were having a really good season. And you know what happened? Wentz got hurt and he was out for the whole season. And you know what the Eagles did? They didn't collapse and fold. They put Nick Foles back in, and Nick Foles won the Super Bowl against Tom Brady. So I'm just saying that you don't always have to roll over and die because you had faced a little bit of adversity. But that was that team. And the thing, Steve, I really hated about that team was I always thought they were frauds. They thought that because they had one good season, they were entitled to some kind of championship caliber status. And they hadn't even played the Colts or the Patriots or any of the other superpowers in the AFC. But to this day, even they still insisted, had Von Olhoffen not intentionally hurt Palmer, that they would have won the Super Bowl that year.
That's just the Bengals for you. That's that era of Bengals, at least. And I don't understand that kind of attitude because, like you said, they never even played like the Patriots or the Colts. Never mind beating them. And plus, a fun fact: Chemo. Remember when Chemo came to the Steelers? Do you know how the Steelers got him? Do you remember that?
Dermontti Dawson.
Yeah, Dermontti Dawson couldn't block him, and when your Hall of Fame center says, "Hey, that guy's pretty good," the Steelers like, "All right, we'll go and get him."
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I just. Yeah, that was the Bengals. You're right, and because of that's for that win has to be in my top 5 most satisfying wins. Period. Any sport in my life as a Pittsburgh sports fan. And then just to hear them whine about it. Carson Palmer, Sports Illustrated did this big cover story about his rehab over the offseason, and all he talked about was just how much he hates the Steelers. And it's like, okay, fine, obsess about us. We were off winning the Super Bowl while you were sitting there obsessing about us.
He cried about it too. Like I remember, they should have never beat the Colts, and they should have never beat the Broncos, and what they do in beating the Seahawks? It's like, get over yourself. Like you would have been able to do that.
He acted like a fan on Twitter, right? You really deserved it. It's like you're the starting quarterback for the team. Like you worry about next season. Again, it's just a bunch of babies. It was so satisfying. It's not like beating Baltimore. Beating Baltimore, there's been so many huge wins against the Ravens, but Baltimore's a well-run franchise with good players, and when you beat them, it feels good because you're beating a big rival who's a really big challenge. The Bengals were frauds, and it was so fun to just expose them as the frauds that they were. I have a clip here, and it's in the clip, you'll hear 2 things. You'll hear Joey Porter on the sidelines as kind of the seconds were ticking away and the fans were starting to file out of the stadium. So it's Joey Porter taunting the fans. And then the second half of the clip is going to be Bill Cowher in the locker room after that game, mocking the Bengals Who Dey chant.
I'm tired of whooping y'all ass. Y'all make me tired.
I love that. That was great. Cowher just totally mocking. That's the Bengals. If you don't know, that's their big I don't know, Steve, what do you call it? Chant or cheer or whatever.
I guess, yeah. I always thought that was what New Orleans is chant, but I guess it's Cincinnati. I don't know. Maybe there's a large Cajun population in Cincinnati. They come up the Mississippi River that far. I don't know.
Whatever. Who cares? It's stupid.
Do they
And
stop at Cincinnati? Why don't they just keep coming up to Pittsburgh? Because
it was so fun to hear Cowher mock them. One last footnote from that game. Joey Porter, this is what he said about that game shortly afterwards. He said, quote, "I didn't care if Palmer was hurt or not. So I was the bad guy once again. I laughed at their sorrows. Ha ha ha." And just keep that in mind.
oh, Jerry Porter.
Yeah, just keep that in mind, because Porter would once again factor into a Steelers-Bengals huge game many years after his career ended.
Yeah.
That's kind of the end of that era for the Bengals too. There is one more very satisfying victory the next season. So in 2006, the Steelers don't have a very good season as defending Super Bowl champions, and they're way eliminated from the playoffs in the last game of the season, but they're playing in Cincinnati with a chance to eliminate the Bengals from the playoffs. And Bill Cowher's quote before this game was something like "misery loves company." So the Steelers had nothing to play for, but they could knock the Bengals out of the playoffs. And that game actually goes into overtime. And
So you're saying they called more than the same 3 running plays?
yeah, yeah, yes, they did. Yeah, Bill Cowher did not run the ball up the middle. In fact, in overtime, they did this.
He's back, short drop, quick slant, on his way up the left sideline. There goes Santonio. He is going. He's at the 10, 5, touchdown Pittsburgh. Touchdown Pittsburgh.
So that was the end of the Bengals season that year, thanks to Santonio Holmes and the Steelers. And that's actually Bill Cowher's final ever game as head coach. And so his final ever play as head coach is a 67-yard touchdown reception by Holmes in overtime to eliminate the Bengals from the playoffs. And I can't think of a more fitting way for Coach Cowher to go out than that.
That is quite an awesome way to go out for Coach Cowher. I wish he could have made the playoffs one last time, maybe ended on a Super Bowl, but good for Bill. And I can't see why the Bengals fans don't like the Steelers at all. I mean,
You haven't seen anything yet.
Could you imagine being like a Bengals fan that's like 60 or 70 years old? You've had to live through all this. Like,
Yeah,
there's no way you're still a fan at the like you've given up on the Bengals, or maybe you're like it's like Pitt football where you give up on them for a while and then they get good and you're like, oh, I'm back in again. And it's like, oh, why am I a fan? This is like very like Pitt football-esque. Like just the pain just never stops with the Bengals.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Speaking of the pain with the Bengals, by 2008, when the Steelers are on their way to a second Super Bowl victory, the Bengals start that season 0-8. And there's a game on October 19th of that season where the Steelers blow out the Bengals in Cincinnati. That game's notable because Hines Ward breaks the jaw of Bengals linebacker Keith Rivers on just an absolutely vicious block. Rivers was the Bengals' first-round pick that year, and that hit actually ends his season. And the NFL actually institutes a rule after that called the Hines Ward rule, where I guess you're not allowed to hit people too hard or something like that.
You're not allowed to block a guy. It's like a blindside block, like while going towards the goal line or something like that. You have to come from the side or something stupid. It was literally blocking too hard. I think he did get a penalty. I think did Hines Ward get a penalty? I can't remember.
He didn't, because it was legal at the time. But then the NFL had to step in and player safety, blah blah blah. So. But that was memorable. I was at that game, Steve. My dad's birthday is in October, and my brother and I, for his birthday that year, we got tickets and did a road trip to Cincinnati. And I have to say, Cincinnati fans, say what you want, they were definitely very friendly to us that day. I remember one guy ran up because we were all wearing our Steeler gear. One guy ran up to us and started yelling something about how it's something negative about the Steelers. Then he just kind of paused and he's like, no, not really. We suck. And walking out of the stadium, there were these 2 guys that had bags over their head that were holding up this giant sign that said "Fire Mike Brown." And I had my camera with me. I was taking pictures, and I snapped a picture of those two guys. And only like months later, I was looking at my pictures, and I noticed that when I snapped the pictures, one of the two guys flipped me off. So that was
That's I do you blame them?
no, oh no, it was
I-
hilarious. I thought it was so funny. I didn't even realize it at the time until I looked at the picture. But it was, yeah, I'll post that picture on our website because it was really funny. Also of note in 2008, Steve, you mentioned this earlier. Kenny Anderson finally gets a Super Bowl ring, ironically, as the quarterback coach of the Steelers. So after all those years in the 70s of not being able to win a Super Bowl, thanks in large part to the Steelers, Kenny Anderson gets a Super Bowl ring with the Steelers. So good on Kenny Anderson there.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that there's like that Dick LeBeau connection and then Kenny Anderson connection. So there's some weird like Bengal Steeler connections for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe it's just
Marvin Lewis too, because he was on Bill Cowher's staff for. I'm pretty sure he was on that '95 staff that went to the Super Bowl. So he was on Bill Cowher's staff for a while too.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird thing like that. So I don't know what to make of. Maybe the NFL's just like that. They hire a lot of assistants from other teams and stuff. So
yeah, yep. So let's go into the 2010s. In the 2010s, the Bengals
we're done with the aughts.
Done with the aughts. Yep.
Okay.
And in the 10s, the Bengals have a resurgence. They have a new group of stars, including the Red Rifle himself, Andy Dalton, quarterback, and they actually make the playoffs 6 times between 2009 and 2015. Steve, did you remember that they made the playoffs 6 times?
I do remember them being kind of mediocre, and which is sad because this is probably like the golden age of Cincinnati Bengals football, and like they're pretty mediocre. I just remember that I never thought they were like a great team, and people would say, "Oh, they're like they're going to be good." It's like I don't know, they're just kind of okay. It's like I don't know, like and then the same thing with the Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton isn't a bad quarterback, but like. I wouldn't put him in even the same league as like a Trent. Well, he's better than Trent Dilfer, but I'm trying to think of like somebody like that's just kind of like a Nick Foles. Would you? I don't even know.
I'd maybe like Kirk Cousins. How about like somebody like
that? Yeah. It's like he puts up a lot of stats, but he never really seems to win even the big regular season games. Never mind a big playoff game. So I don't know. At least Nick Foles has that going for him. He seems Nick Foles is like the opposite. He seems like he saves all his wins for the playoffs. It's like you wheel him on the playoffs. He's like Superman.
I just would not have guessed 6 playoff appearances between 09 and 15. I just wouldn't have. I remember them, like you said, being, decent, but 6 playoff appearances, I just wouldn't have guessed that.
But it seemed like them in Houston played every wild card weekend. It was like, oh, it's Cincinnati and Houston again. It's like, oh, okay. And like neither of those teams were going to contend for the Super Bowl. It was just like, oh, okay. It's just like the opening preview of like before Patriots play somebody, the second best team in the AFC that year.
Yeah, it was like the playing game for the NCAA tournament.
yeah. It's Davison and it's Siena.
Central Kentucky Tech or whatever. Yeah. The Steelers have a couple of down seasons, but by 2014, they're contenders again. And that season, 2014, the Steelers and Bengals play on the final week of the season at Heinz Field to decide a division. Both teams had already clinched a playoff spot, but that game was for the division. And that's one of the really great games that, probably, won't be always remembered. But it was a super competitive game, a lot of big plays. Antonio Brown absolutely dominates that game. He has a 71-yard punt return, touchdown, and a 63-yard touchdown reception to ice the game late. It's a great game, but unfortunately, it ends up working out badly for both teams. The Steelers lose Le'Veon Bell to an injury, and the Bengals lose A.J. Green, their star receiver. And, both teams, the Steelers and the Bengals, lose their subsequent playoff games the next week, largely due to missing their offensive stars. So the rivalry is back at this point, and it's really starting to turn ugly. There's a bunch of incidents. This is a not totally complete list, but here's some of the things that were notable. Pittsburgh linebacker Terrence Garvin Remember Terrence Garvin, Steve? No.
No, not at
Yeah.
all.
Anyway, Pittsburgh linebacker Terrence Garvin breaks the jaw and neck of Cincinnati's punter on a hit and draws a $25,000 fine from the league. I think that was on a Antonio Brown punt return, and Garvin just levels the Cincinnati punter, breaks his neck. So a lot of people in Cincinnati were upset about that one. Mike Tomlin and Bengals safety Reggie Nelson get into it after a game. Tomlin was upset about a late hit. I think that was actually the game that I just referenced where Bell got hurt. And the guy that hit him was Nelson, and Tomlin felt like that was not a clean hit, and they got into it after the game. Mike Munchak, Hall of Fame offensive line coach, also gets into it with Nelson in a different game. And this one was not after the game, it was actually during a game, and draws a personal foul penalty. So, pretty interesting note on Mike Munchak's career that he incurred a personal foul call 20 years after his retirement.
I remember that Mike Munchak thing. Like, didn't he grab his hand?
He grabbed his hair because Reggie Nelson had dreadlocks sticking out of his helmet. And I think Nelson kind of ran into him, and Munchak took exception to it and grabbed his hair. And that drew a flag. But that was just kind of funny.
And Munchak wasn't stand sometimes they stand right at the edge of the he was well into the bench too, if I remember correctly. But
yeah, Nelson probably did it on purpose. I'm just gonna assume that. Well, one guy, Reggie Nelson had some run-ins with Steeler coaches, but the guy that was really at ground zero and all this ugliness is a guy named Vontaze Burfict, Bengals linebacker. He knocks Le'Veon Bell out for the season in 2015 and then celebrates the hit after the play. A lot of the Steelers players were really pissed off about that one. Ramon Foster says, quote, "That's what type of guy he is, and he'll get his." Burfict and Vince Williams and James Harrison get into a pregame skirmish before a 2015 game. James Harrison's another guy that kind of crossed over between teams. He spent that year with the Bengals, remember. Burfict kicks Roosevelt Nix during a game, and he also gets fined for dirty hits on Antonio Brown and James Conner in another game. So Vontaze Burfict was definitely public enemy number one for the Steelers and their fans pretty much the whole time he played in Cincinnati.
He just didn't. It wasn't just the Steelers too. I remember there was a game with Cam Newton in Carolina. Remember that he was twisting his foot after his ankle and stuff after the play was over. And and the league just let that go on and on and on. A Steeler play, Harrison, when he was with the Steelers, would just sneeze on somebody, and the league would be $10,000 fine. Burfict, at some point, don't you need to go to the soccer rule where you've accumulated so many, personal fouls? In soccer, if you get so many yellow cards, they start to suspend you from games. And that's what I always felt if you're really serious about player safety and blah 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 and whatever, this isn't just window dressing, then you need to come up with a rule. If you get so many personal fouls, you're suspended for a game. And then and then you get so many more, you're expended for 6 games, and then it's a year, and then it's a playoffs, or even better, just suspend somebody for the playoffs. If your team makes the playoffs, or whatever team you go to, if that team makes the playoffs, you're not allowed to play in the first playoff game, whenever that is. And see, that'll put an end to guys like him in a minute. They're either going to clean up their act, or a team can't afford to pay a guy like that to not play in the playoffs.
So the NFL eventually does do that. It's not until years later. It's when Burfict is playing for the Raiders. He hits a guy in the head for the Colts, and they suspend him for an entire rest of the season. It was in week 4 or something.
Yeah, they finally did something about it, but it was too little, too late. They should just come up with the policy, just a rote policy. You get so many personal fouls, you're out for 1 game, and then if you come back and you get 1 or 2 more, you're out for 6 games. And then you're out for playoff games, and that'll the guy's either gonna just adjust his play, or he's going to be out of the league, and either one is fine with me. And I would say if it was a Steeler or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. Making it subjective and making it, NFL discipline when they feel like finally disciplining it, that's way too subjective. And like you said, because of that, he was allowed to, caused a lot of chaos for a lot of years.
And it wasn't just with the Steelers. It really
yeah.
wasn't. It really wasn't. It was, like I said, there was and it just like I said, it wasn't like, oh, like sometime. I remember one time Harrison hit a wide receiver from Cleveland, and it was kind of questionable. Maybe he didn't hit him in the shoulder, maybe him in the shoulder slid into his head. No, like Cam Newton was literally laying on the ground and he's sitting there twisting his ankle. Like, that's not part of any part of football. He wasn't advancing the ball. He's laying on the ground. He's already down. That's literally intent to injure. I mean, I don't understand why. I don't understand why why the league was so lenient towards him and not other people. So,
Yep, totally agree.
yeah. And
So-
it wasn't like he played for New York or something. I don't know. That's enough about perfect.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. You're absolutely right. There was no reason why he should have been allowed to cause chaos for as long as he caused chaos for. So the Steelers Bengals quickly kind of becomes a cringeworthy affair whenever they play each other. In 2015, the Bengals put together one of the best seasons that they've ever had. They go 12-4 and they win the division. And the only other times that the Bengals won that many games, they made it to the Super Bowl both times. So that was a banner year for the Bengals, going 12-4. The Steelers that year squeezed into the playoffs with some help on the last week of the season from the Buffalo Bills. And that sets up a second Steelers-Bengals playoff game almost 10 years to the day after the first one. And oh my, is it the mother of all Steelers-Bengals games. Again, the game is in Cincinnati, just like it was a decade earlier. And again, the Bengals have a problem at quarterback. Andy Dalton had been injured before the game. It wasn't the Steelers' fault this time.
Kimo von Oelhoffen was well retired. Yeah.
They have to start A.J. McCarron at quarterback. And that definitely hurts their offense. The Steelers build a 15-0 lead into the fourth quarter, but Burfict hits Ben with yet another cheap shot, and Ben has to be carted off the field. Classy Bengals fans, as Ben's being carted off the field, held him with beer cans and cheer as he's being carted off the field with a very severe shoulder injury.
They thought he was thirsty.
Yeah, I'm sure that was it. So without Ben Roethlisberger, the Bengals are able to mount a huge comeback. McCarron hits AJ Green for a go-ahead touchdown with 2 minutes left. Landry Jones is in the game for the Steelers, playing like Landry Jones. He comes in to try to lead a last-second drive, and he throws what is presumably a game-ending interception to, of all people, Vontaze Burfict.
Yeah, to Mr. Cheap Shot artist. Yeah.
And the feeling at that moment was so low, Steve, because here the Steelers are going to lose a playoff game because Burfict took out. That was the season that Burfict had taken out Le'Veon Bell. So we didn't have Le'Veon Bell because Burfict took him out. And then he takes out Ben. And then he's going to get the game-ending interception. I mean, it wasn't right. It wasn't justice.
Well, and two, it's like, this is after the NFL, remember, cracked down on the Steelers for hitting people too hard. But now the Bengals are allowed to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a terrible feeling. Well, what happens next will be talked about for, I think, generations, because it's still, to this day, I can't believe it happened. So the Bengals are trying to kill the clock at this point. They run the ball with Jeremy Hill, their running back. He's stripped by Ryan Shazier, and the Steelers get the ball back. I mean, I think, if not for what happened next, that would be remembered as one of the biggest errors of all time, because at that point in the game, you're just holding on to the ball. You're just trying not to fumble. You're already in field goal range. That's all you have to do. Just don't fumble, and Jeremy Hill fumbles. Ben then limps back out onto the field. I guess they figured that Ben Roethlisberger with, 10% of his shoulder was better than Landry Jones with 100% of his shoulder. And that was pretty amazing, because remember, it wasn't that he just got hurt. He was carted off the field. But he limps back on there. He attempts to lead the Steelers on a last-second drive, and he does make a few plays, including a fourth down conversion. But he can't. It's pretty obvious he can't throw the ball more than 5 or 6 yards. So they're just trying to dink their way down the field 5 or 6 yards at a time, and that's not really working, because They get the ball to about midfield. There's 20 seconds left, but they're out of timeouts at this point. So that means they have to throw towards the sidelines. They have to at least take a shot somewhat deep. It's also raining, which means that, the Steelers can't exactly attempt a 40 or 50-yard field goal because the weather's ugly. So still, even with the Jeremy Hill fumble, the odds of the Steelers pulling this off are slim to none at this point. Roethlisberger attempts a pass over the middle to Brown. It's incomplete, but he's hit in the head by who else? Vontaze Burfict. Draws a 15-yard personal foul penalty. Brown is concussed on the play. He's lying on the field and being attended to. One of the guys out there helping him off the field is Joey Porter, who is now an assistant coach for the Steelers. And
Jerry Porter.
Jerry Porter. Whether or not Porter's allowed to be out there is kind of up for debate. But regardless, he's out there, and he and Pac-Man Jones start jawing with each other because Porter was the bad guy again. Ha ha ha. And Jones inexplicably tries to throw a punch at Porter from like a mile away. Like he wasn't even close to him, and he tries to just take a swing at him. He hits an official in the back of the head instead, and he gets flagged for a 15-yard penalty. So the Steelers literally get 30 yards by doing nothing. They trot out rookie kicker Chris Boswell. He calmly drills the game-winning field goal, and the Steelers walk away with the victory, and the Bengals are eliminated in what was their best season since their Super Bowl year. I'll just say it bluntly, it's the stupidest collapse in the history of sports.
This is worse than Buckner, or I can't even think of, or like Jose Lee, or Francisco Cabrera,
or the Falcons losing the lead to the Patriots. I mean, those are all really bad losses.
At least the other team made plays that the Steelers literally just stood there and got hit. Yeah.
Right. And the perfect hit on Brown, I mean, if that were any other player, because sometimes, on a play, on a bang play over the middle, sometimes you hit a guy in the head. It's not necessarily on purpose, and they're just going to call anything that's helmet to helmet. But that was the way Burfict played. It wasn't a surprise that he would try to lead with his head, and as bad as that was, Pac-Man Jones, I mean, another fine West Virginia alum, Pac-Man Jones, what are you doing? Like, it's an assistant coach who retired years ago. Why are you getting into a fight with him? And why in the name of all things holy would you throw a punch at him? I mean, it's just the dumbest thing ever. The Bengals have the game won. They melt down. They hand the Steelers a victory. And I talked about the top 5 most satisfying wins. This one's in here too. I mean, both of those playoff games against the Bengals were just in my top 5 most satisfying wins. And yeah, it sucked. Brown didn't play the next week, and Ben was hurt, and Bell was already hurt. So Burfict took out our whole offense that year, and we lost the divisional round to Denver in a really close game. However, it was worth it to just beat them in that fashion.
Well, if you don't remember, Pac-Man Jones went on the Dan Patrick Show the next week and stated that Antonio Brown was faking a concussion. So to beat Pac-Man Jones and the Cincinnati Bengals, the Steelers organization literally held him out against Denver just to beat you, just to prove a point that he really wasn't concussed. What kind of insane? And Dan Patrick sat there and it just like didn't question it, just like sat there and accepted it with a straight face. Like that's still to this day, and how many years ago that still annoys me. So, and people wonder why nobody takes the media serious anymore. Yeah, when you just let crap like that get said and don't even challenge it, come on, man. That's the quote. Yeah, our current president. That's ridiculous. Though.
Yeah, that was embarrassing. I mean, it was embarrassing enough the way they lost, but then the way they carried themselves afterwards, and then he was also very upset that Porter was even out there.
Jerry Porter.
Jerry Porter. He didn't even call him the right name. Didn't even know who he was. What's Jerry Porter doing out? I mean, it was the biggest embarrassment ever. Honestly, how Marvin Lewis was still allowed to be employed after that game is beyond my comprehension.
For years, yeah.
Yeah, and it just says everything you need to know about the ownership. You know, it's you know, to do another Simpsons reference, there's the Superintendent Chalmers is at the school, and the guy's like, they hire Skinner back. He'd been fired, I guess, and somebody's like, "You're really going to hire that guy back?" And Chalmers is like, "Well, he seems to know the children's names," and that seems to be the way that
Yeah.
Mike Brown, you know, decided to determine who coached the Bengals, because that was the ugliest collapse of all time, and showed that Marvin Lewis just had no control over the team. So Bengals fans are understandably devastated. That was their last best chance to win a playoff game, and they haven't even sniffed the postseason since. The Bengals' last playoff win, as we already detailed, came in 1990 against the Houston Oilers, a team which no longer exists. That's
Well,
how
they're
long
the
ago that was.
Tennessee Titans now. I
Well,
guess.
yeah, but they're not.
They were the
Houston Oilers.
Tennessee Oilers there. Who knew Tennessee was an oil producing state? But-
Speaking of Bengals fans, that game also produced the crying
yeah.
Bengals lady meme. It was, if you've never seen that, it was basically a screenshot that from the end of that game, there was a woman in the stands with tears literally streaming down her face with Bengals gear on, and that just became a meme for years and years. It just blew up into one of those big internet themes. You know, to her credit, she has a pretty good sense of humor about it. She starts a Twitter feed and an Instagram account as like crying Bengals fan or something like that, and gains a lot of followers. Actually appears in some of Pittsburgh Dad's episodes of his YouTube channel. So kudos to her. She kind of took something that was, you know, potentially very embarrassing and kind of turned it into something fun. You know, and honestly, who hasn't been there where you're devastated by your team's loss, especially, my God, if you're a Bengals fan, I can't even imagine.
Yeah. You just this is you should like file for divorce from your team. You're being abused. You're just being taken advantage of at this point. It isn't fair. I mean, this is ridiculous.
The ugliness between these two teams continues for the next couple of seasons. It really culminates in the infamous 2017 Monday night game that we talked about in our previous episode that we did about the 2017 season. It's I said it, and then I'll say it again. It's the sickest I've ever felt watching a sporting event. It's just 3 hours of guys taking headshots and literally trying to severely injure each other. It also results in Ryan Shazier being paralyzed and never playing again. I think the only, if there's any good takeaway from that atrocity of a football game, it's that it essentially kind of marks the end of that era. Perfect, as we said earlier, is basically forced out of the league a few years later, and the animosity just kind of simmers down over time. So the 2010s, you think about that fierce rivalry, you think about all the dirty hits and all the hatred between the two clubs. During the 2010s, the Steelers and Bengals played 21 times. The Bengals only won 3 of those. That's another thing that I would never have guessed. I thought it was a little more evenly matched than that. I know we mostly got the best of them, but 3 times in the whole decade they beat us. Steve, would you have guessed that?
No, I thought they would have won more, but I guess in the 2010s you got to figure. Boy, yeah, it seems like with Dalton they had a better team.
They went to the
should've-
playoffs 6 times.
Yeah.
You know, how many times did we go to the playoffs? I mean, not more than that. So yeah, it was surprising. I didn't realize they only beat us 3 times that whole decade. So
Yeah, it is 3 times, and they play us twice a year. So
yeah, and the playoff game. So 21 times that they played
and they
in
only
10 years.
They
Yeah.
lost 18 of 21.
Yep.
Yikes! I mean, if Jerry Porter wouldn't have been there, it only was Joey Porter. Yeah, I think that playoff win is like one that's going to haunt their franchise for a while. That's going to be a tough one to shake off, and if they ever do, I don't know.
Yeah. So that's kind of the history of the rivalry. Let's talk a little bit about the future. Right now, the Bengals are building once again. They have a young head coach. They have a potentially generational quarterback in Joe Burrow. The Steelers' future is kind of uncertain. You know, that Ben Roethlisberger is probably playing in his final season this year. So, you know, what's going to happen in the 2020s? Hard to say. Hard to say what's going to happen for either team.
Who's the quarterback of the second game for the Bengals last year, the one where the Bengals won. I don't
Oh
even
gosh.
I don't even know that guy's name. I mean, the Steelers played so bad that game. Oh jeez.
Yeah. Yeah. Samir not going to work here anymore. Like that's somebody that won't be around too much longer. Yeah.
Because Joe Burrow was hurt by that point, so yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. They actually split the series last season.
Somehow the Bengals screwed Joe Burrow up or something, and he's from Ohio too. So
Yeah.
they got the quarterback and they build the rest of the team around him. So
Yeah, they got the quarterback. They have really good young receivers. They just drafted that kid this year. I mean, so you know, it's kind of like the '90s where they had these top picks for a few years, and will it pan out or will it not? And time will tell. And then the Steelers, obviously, tons of question marks there, right? Because it's going to be the end of the Ben Roethlisberger era, and what happens after that? We definitely saw what happened for the many years between the 70s and Ben, where the Steelers didn't have a franchise quarterback, and that, you know, resulted in some success, but never a championship. So lots of question marks. But you know, there'll be plenty of more Steelers Bengals moments, I'm sure, in this series. There'll be plenty of more stories and characters that grow out of this rivalry. That's pretty much a guarantee. Steve, any last thoughts on Steelers and Bengals?
hopefully the Bengals lady doesn't have to cry too much more. But hey, you never know.
Well, I kind of hope she does have to cry a lot more.
You're wishing ill.
Nothing against her personally, but hopefully her team will lose a lot. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Please give us a review. Please tell your friends. Check us out on the web or social media. Those links are all in the show description. Catch you next time.